Almost all polar bears die of starvation because they die of old age. And there are no nursing homes for polar bears. They'll all be gone by 2100. This is one of those predictions that's difficult, especially about the future. And they just go on about it as if they really know what's going to happen in the year 2100, which is ridiculous. They don't know that. And there's no indication that the polar bear is in any way endangered. Today, even today, in the winter, the entire Arctic Ocean is frozen. And then some, out into the Bering Sea, into Hudson's Bay, towards Norway. It's not just the Arctic Ocean that's floated, that's frozen. It's extended out far beyond that. So if the ice recedes a bit, and right now only about half, although this year is there's more ice than there has been for like 12 years or something. So maybe it's going back into another trend. That means the sun can reach the ocean's surface in the Arctic and promote the growth of plankton, which then is eaten by krill, which is eaten by fish, which is eaten by seals, which are eaten by polar bears.
All right, guys, welcome back to Yanasa TV's As a Man Thinketh. Love him or hate him, our guest today is a man who is no stranger to controversy. As a doctor of ecology from the University of British Columbia, and he actually has an honorary doctorate of science from NC State University. Patrick Moore has been on both the front lines of the environmental movement, and he has, some would say he's been on the front lines of the opposite side. However, I would argue that as an ecologist, Patrick Moore takes a realistic standpoint to science, and the things and points that he has to say will really make you think about our environment, our climate, and what impacts we make that are good and what impacts we make that are bad. He's not saying that all of our impacts are beneficial. Patrick Moore has a lot of great insight on this subject, and so I asked him to come on to the show to kind of help share some of that insight with you guys and help people start to see things from a perspective. Not all scientists agree with some sort of consensus out there. And I think that the more you listen to different people with doctorate degrees and real PhDs, the more you'll start to hear differences of opinion on this subject. And they're all very educated. I like Patrick Moore's opinion on some things. He and I don't agree on everything, but like I've said before on our channel, that's not what this is about. This is about helping people start to think for themselves, and we're not going to do that unless we hear the whole conversation. So welcome to the show, Patrick Moore. Patrick, let's talk about polar bears for a moment, because we've seen a lot of pictures out there of dying, starving polar bears in the Arctic. If CO2 if the Arctic isn't melting because of man-made global warming, wouldn't these polar bears be thriving today?
They're a classic example of a fake remote catastrophe, because of course polar bears aren't invisible, but it's not as if everyone can fly to the Arctic and go around the whole Arctic Circle and count the polar bears. So they can make up a story. And the story they've made up is that polar bears are threatened with extinction from melting ice. And all of that is completely wrong. How many people know that in 1973, on the advice of wildlife biologists, all of the polar nations signed an international treaty ending the unrestricted hunting of polar bears? Some countries like Norway banned the killing of polar bears altogether, made them a sacred species, basically. Whereas Canada still allows 2% of the population, 50% male and female in even numbers, as long as you hire an Inuit guide, which gives the Inuit guide some income. So that treaty was signed when the polar bear population had declined due to overhunting to between 6,000 and 8,000 in the whole Arctic. Today, the polar bear population, and everybody accepts this, that's what you're not hearing much about polar bears these days, is 30 to 50,000. That's the population. And they are fat and healthy. And that's for two reasons, I believe. And so does Susan Crockford, who is possibly the world's expert that isn't all biased by research money on this subject. She lives in Victoria on Vancouver Island, just south of me, and we correspond a lot. The reason the polar bear numbers increased was, one, they stopped overhunting them. It had become too easy for rich people to fly to the Arctic and hire an Inuit guide and get a few polar bear rugs for themselves. So that ended, and the population began to grow. But in the last 10 years or so, there has been less ice in the summer in the Arctic than there was previously. Today, even today, in the winter, the entire Arctic Ocean is frozen. And then some, out into the Bering Sea, into Hudson's Bay, towards Norway. It's not just the Arctic Ocean that's floating, that's frozen. It's extended out far beyond that. That is where the bears hunt for seals. It's in the winter. They don't hunt for seals in the summer. So if the ice recedes a bit, and right now only about half, although this year is there's more ice than there has been for like 12 years or something. So maybe it's going back into another trend, but we don't know that because the future is difficult to predict. But now the ice is only covering about half the Arctic. That means the sun can reach the ocean's surface in the Arctic and promote the growth of plankton, which then is eaten by krill, which is eaten by fish, which is eaten by seals, which are eaten by polar bears. So it may well be that a reduction in summer ice extent increases the food supply for polar bears. They are all fat right now. Yeah, the only ones that aren't are the old ones that are dying. And National Geographic had the nerve to put a picture of an old dying polar bear in the summer when there's no snow, and everybody thinks, oh, the Arctic is supposed to have snow. No, a lot of it melts in the summer because it's 24-hour sunshine for 6 months, and then it's 24-hour darkness for 6 months. People should go up there and see it for themselves, but not everybody can afford that, so they make up stories. Almost all polar bears die of starvation because they die of old age. And there are no nursing homes for polar bears. So they have to die out in the open with no teeth left because they're old and they've worn their teeth down and they can't hunt anymore. And there is nothing that can hunt them even when they're dying. Because when one of those big paws, polar bears are half again as big as grizzly bears, which are big in themselves. And so a polar bear can just, the only reason the Inuit people could go to the Arctic was because they had the dogs, the sled dogs. That was the absolute necessity to protect them from polar bears. And that's how they hunted polar bears. The dogs would surround the polar bears and distract them while the Inuit came in with spears and speared them. And that's how they got a lot of their meat. They also, though, ate predominantly marine mammals, just like the polar bear does. And not many people know that the polar bear evolved from the European brown bear or the Eurasian brown bear, which is the same species as the grizzly bear, which came across the land bridge during a glacial maximum, like we did. We don't know exactly when the grizzly bear came across. Well, the Eurasian brown bear came across and turned into what we call a grizzly bear, but they can still mate with each other easily. They are basically the same species. They don't have a different species name. They're called Ursus arctus, I believe, again for Arctic, but they're not really an Arctic species in the sense they don't live on ice in the winter. They live on the land and they hibernate in the winter, whereas polar bears hibernate in the summer, just the females. And so they have become two different subspecies or species, depending on how you want to divide them. And they've given the polar bear a separate Latin name, Ursus maritimus, meaning sea bear, because they can swim better than any other bear. They have to swim between ice floes. And everybody thought they're all going to die on an iceberg because there's no ice around, But no, they can swim for miles. And now there are 30 to 50,000 of them. They are fat and happy. And there isn't as much talk about them anymore because people like myself and Susan Crockford have set the record straight in writing and in interviews like this so that people can understand this. You see, the Inuit people 2 years ago. They have a government in Iqaluit, which is at the southern end of Baffin Island, which is Canada's largest island. And this is in Nunavut, which is the territory where there are no trees, which is the Inuit territory. And they have many villages around Baffin Island and northern Quebec where they live year round, small villages of 50, 100 people. And in those villages, they are now being attacked by polar bears, ransacking their homes and even killing people. So they passed a polar bear management plan for Nunavut, which allows them to defend themselves from polar bears. In other words, to kill them if they are in self-defense. Whereas that was a difficult problem before. If you killed a polar bear before, they didn't care what the reason was. You'd done something bad because it's an endangered species. So the Inuit have made it clear that this is no longer an endangered species. They don't have unrestricted hunting. It's all regulated completely. But they have the right to defend themselves from rogue polar bears. Now, the activists say, oh, the reason the polar bears are going into the villages is because there isn't enough food in the Arctic because the ice is melting. This is a lie. All you have to do is look at the map of the satellite image of the North Pole, which is published every year at the peak of the ice, and see that the ice is covering the entire Arctic Ocean to this day in the winter, all winter. So that's the story of the polar bear. There is no reason to be worried about its demise whatsoever. So now what are they saying? They'll all be gone by 2100. This is one of those predictions that's difficult, especially about the future. And they just go on about it as if they really know what's going to happen in the year 2100, which is ridiculous. They don't know that. And there's no indication that the polar bear is in any way endangered. But the final point about the polar bear that is the most interesting point in many ways is there would be no polar bears if it weren't for climate change. They are the product of climate change. Because when the Pleistocene ice age set on and the Arctic began to freeze, it created a habitat for bears to hunt seals on the ice, because they keep a blowhole and they have their young on the ice. They come up to give birth. Before that, there was no habitat like that. So Eurasian brown bears started going out on the ice, and eventually, due to isolation, geographical isolation, that's how species go. Divergent species evolution is when one species turns into two. And that's what happened with the Eurasian brown bear. Some of them turned into polar bears. It took 100,000 years or more for that evolutionary change to occur. But it has occurred, and it only occurred because of climate change.
Patrick, thank you for joining us on As a Man Thinketh. I appreciate your opinions on these things, and I hope that everything that you had to say helps those out there want to research more and understand a little more about our ecology and how all of these things work together, and why there's a lot of fear out there that they don't have to buy into. And in fact, in my opinion, I think that this fear-mongering that's going on is turning people away from caring about our environment. I've always said that people shouldn't you shouldn't have to scare people into caring about their environment. It's something we should all naturally want to do for our environment. But when you start to throw out misinformation, or you start to throw out things that just aren't scientifically accurate, they can't be scientifically accurate, what it ends up doing is it actually turns people off from caring about the environment. And that's the last thing that anybody wants. And so I appreciate your thoughts. I think that it's important that we look at things from a scientific reality. And then from there, people can decide, how they want to move forward. They don't have to worry as much about how every little thing that they're doing is impacting the environment, but they can start thinking about how they want to treat their environment and make it the most productive use of their footprint.